All right. I have two stories tonight, but I think someone's going to do one before, in between. My first story is called Leather Boys. One day, way back when I was in kindergarten, I was in my uncle's backyard playing with another boy. His name was Paul, and he was in the second grade. Although he was a little older, he was always a little guy. When he got older, he looked a lot like the actor Joseph Gordon-Levitt. Now, I don't remember what we were playing, and it doesn't matter, but Paul and I got in a big fight. And he pushed me off the porch, which was only 3 feet high, but there was a bush, and it had been trimmed, and there were sharp branches sticking up, and so I fell on it, and I cut my mouth, and I had to be taken to the hospital, and had my lip sewed up, about 4 stitches. Very dramatic experience for a 6-year-old boy, but I survived. Now, I didn't tell you why we were fighting. We got in a big argument. We argued about who had the prettiest shoes. Paul had on Cordovan penny loafers, and I was wearing yellow brogans, or brogans, as my dad would say. It's strange that we would be fighting, that I would be fighting about that, because I always hated those shoes. They were ugly and made me look like a hick. But Paul challenged me and said his were better, and so I had to defend my honor and my shoes, even though I didn't like them. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Paul. He came from an interesting family. A lot like somebody you would read in a William Faulkner novel. I don't think I actually said this, just some of you already know this, but I grew up in a rural community in North Carolina, not far from the Raleigh-Durham area. He came from an interesting family, very much like something out of Faulkner. And I had to axe to grind with him, and I don't hold it against him for pushing me off the porch. We were just kids. But he had an interesting family history. His great-grandparents, who died long before I was born, were wealthy landowners who also were publishers of the local newspaper. His grandparents were also prominent. His grandfather was a farmer who owned a lot of land and a lot of cattle that was always getting out of the pasture and into our yard. And I did not like stepping into cow pies, or cow pudding, some people call it. I wonder why someone would call cow shit something that sounds delicious. I don't know. Maybe people used to eat that. And Paul's grandmother was a respected educator. She taught school for many years. She was the principal of the local school, and in her later years, she was elected to the county school board. And yet, of her 5 grandchildren, only 2 managed to go through school without repeating a grade. And the youngest did not finish high school, and none of the 5 ever went to college. Now, how does a family go from, respected educators to barely getting through school? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but this I do know about Paul's grandparents. They were first cousins. And it's usually not a good idea when people are that closely related, to marry and have children, because it can affect your offspring. Paul's grandparents had a son, Paul's father, and a daughter I just found out about, who died as a teenager. I didn't know Paul's father very well, although they lived nearby. He was aloof and somewhat mysterious. I never was quite sure what he did for a living. Worked for some company, I guess. But my family's housekeeper said that Paul's father was a thief who stole from his employers. And he drank a bit, and I think he had a hard time holding him to a job. Now, this family had such promise, and Paul's youngest brother, George, was always bragging about his family. He said that his family were descendants of William Penn, the Quaker who founded Pennsylvania. He also said they were descendants of Napoleon Bonaparte. I learned to be skeptical about anything that George said when he and I would go fishing down by the river. Anything I caught, he said, belonged to him because his grandfather owned the river. No one owned the river. George didn't turn out too well. He dropped out of high school, ended up spending a few years in prison, and for many years he's been living on the family farm. No job, no wife or kids, and no driver's license. He's not allowed to drive. But every once in a while you'll hear him sneak off on his moped up the road, and we all know where he's going, to the crack house. Now, what happened to Paul? We didn't hang out as much as we got older. Although I remember in the 6th grade, it was Paul who gave me the idea to dye my hair like he did. I got a bottle of peroxide and turned myself from brown hair to blonde. My dad didn't like that too much. Thought I was different enough already. And Paul started drinking long before I did. Not that I was a big drinker, but I had my first beer when I was 16. Paul started much younger. I remember the day that my mom and I and the lady next door stood in our yards and watched Paul trying to crawl out of the ditch. We didn't know at first what was wrong with him. Of course, then later we figured out he was just totally drunk. And he was a little guy. And he was young. He couldn't have been more than 13, 14 years old. When after I went off to college, and then later I moved to New York, I didn't have any contact with Paul or his family. Didn't hear anything until sometime in the early 1980s, I heard that Paul was dead. He died long before his father passed away, and even before his grandparents. He had not yet reached the age of 30. It happened somewhere in Texas. He had joined a motorcycle gang, and he was stabbed to death by a member of a rival gang. I don't know why they killed him, maybe just because he was in another gang, or maybe they argued over who had the prettiest boots. I don't know. Now, this was supposed to be the end of the story, but then a week ago, I was talking to my mom, and she told me something that just blew me away. She said that it was a shame, it was sad that how the kids had turned out. Now, I think the 3 elders are doing okay, but she was talking about George, the crackhead, and Paul, who had died so young. And she said that it was a shame that the kids had been neglected by their parents. That it was the grandmother that raised them as best as she could, who looked after them, while the parents ran off and did their own thing. I don't know, drinking, hanging out. Nothing wrong with that. But then there was something else. She told me that I never heard anybody back home do this. I read about it, I'd seen it in the movies, but it always took place in New York or California or somewhere more cosmopolitan, never in a rural county in North Carolina. You know what they were doing? Some people would call it wife swapping. They were swingers. Did the kids ever find out? I don't know. I hope not. I'm not going to tell them. What I said about the grandparents being first cousins and maybe being the cause of their kids, their grandkids, slowness, difficulty in learning. I take that back. This was not just an issue of, this was not an issue of nature. It was more of an issue of lack of nurturing. What would the parents say? I don't know. Maybe they would say, as Pope Benedict just said the other day, blame it on the 60s. Thank you very much.
Once again, thank you everybody. Always fabulous. Monday nights, again after quiz night, which is awesome. Storytelling nights, true stories told live without notes, just like the moment. Happy the moment. But I think it's a cool idea. We like to have it in Brooklyn, so tell everybody support. And actually, you have another storyteller.